Hey guys, this is Natasha MS, and I'm here today to share with you some very interesting information on cardiovascular disease and, I got that reversed, on fat and cardiovascular disease. So let's get into it. I was researching and comparing different studies for hours and days to find out if saturated fat was associated with cardiovascular disease. And I came across this one called Dietary Total Fat, Fatty Acids Intake and Risk of Cardiovascular Disease, a Dose-Response Meta-Analysis of Cohort Studies. This is, and I quote, the first study to investigate the effect of dietary total fat and fatty acid intake on cardiovascular disease risk based on dose-response meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies. And what they basically did was take all the studies they found that involved fat and cardiovascular disease and combine the information into this one article, which made it so much easier to find everything in one place. Here's a graph to show you more detail how they sorted these studies. And with this, they put together the forest plots. So this is what they found from it. Highest versus lowest levels of dietary monounsaturated fatty acids were not associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease. Highest versus lowest levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids were not associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease. What about saturated fat? Highest versus lowest levels of dietary saturated fatty acids were not associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease. So that leaves trans fat. Results from this meta-analysis did not detect any relationship of dietary total fat, polyunsaturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, and saturated fatty acids intake with cardiovascular disease risk. However, we found that dietary trans fatty acids intake had a dose-response association with cardiovascular disease risk. So out of these fats, only trans fat had an association with cardiovascular disease. And they also go on to mention, in contrast to popular accepted viewpoints, we did not detect a positive association between total dietary fat intake and cardiovascular disease risk. For decades, it has been believed that fat intake was a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, based on the presumptions that dietary fat can increase low-density lipoprotein, LDL, cholesterol, and blood pressure, therefore increase cardiovascular disease risk. This viewpoint might be based on selective emphasis on some studies, but ignore other studies that do not support these conclusions. Previous meta-analysis also suggested no association between total dietary fat intake and endometrial cancer, ulcerative colitis, and breast cancer mortality, adding new information to reconsider the recommendations of dietary guidelines to reduce fat intake. Even though this study does not support the popular viewpoints that dietary fat intake could increase cardiovascular disease risk, it is possible that the role of dietary fat played in the development of cardiovascular disease might be confounded by the fat sources. For instance, vegetables and fruits play protective roles in the development of cardiovascular disease. However, we cannot investigate the different effects of fat from animal, vegetables, and fruit separately in this current meta-analysis. So, yes, I found this article very helpful and interesting, and would advise you to actually share it with somebody you think would also find this interesting. Also, let me know in the comments what you think. And I think that is all I have to say right now, because I'm kind of hungry, so bye!